She stood at the center of the grand bedchamber, still wearing her wedding gown. The silk was heavy against her skin, the candlelight soft and golden around her. She had not moved since he closed the door behind him. He had not touched her. He had not kissed her. He had barely looked at her throughout the entire ceremony. But she had told herself that things would change once they were alone, once the noise faded, once he could see her, truly see her. He had stood near the mantel, his back to her, shoulders rigid beneath the perfectly tailored coat. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she expected, but it cut deeper than any blade. "This is a marriage of convenience, you know that. I will give you my name, my protection, and a comfortable life. But do not expect warmth, do not expect affection, and do not ever expect me to love you." The door clicked shut behind him. The sound echoed through the room, into her chest, and settled there like a stone. Alara Vance, now Alara Blackwood, Duchess of Ashbourne, remained motionless for a long time. Her hands trembled against the folds of her gown. She had known the marriage was built on a fragile arrangement. Her father, a wealthy merchant, had paid off the late Duke's staggering debts in exchange for a title. The new Duke, Alexander Blackwood, needed her dowry to save Ashbourne Hall from ruin. She was the price he had been forced to pay. But somewhere in her heart, she had nurtured a quiet, tender hope that perhaps the coldness was only temporary. That behind that stern, handsome face, there might be space for something more. That hope shriveled now, silent and small, as she stood alone on her wedding night. She did not cry. She had spent too many years learning to hide tears from a father who saw them as weakness. Instead, she unpinned her veil with slow, careful fingers, laid it upon the bed, and watched the candle burn low until morning. The first weeks at Ashbourne Hall taught Alara exactly how visible her invisibility would be. The servants were polite but distant, their eyes carrying the same guarded caution as their master. Meals were often taken in separate rooms. Whenever she entered a space he occupied, the Duke would briefly glance up, nod with impersonal courtesy, and return to his papers. Conversation never moved beyond the weather or household accounts. If she dared to ask a personal question, his answers were clipped, final. One afternoon, she descended the staircase and heard voices drifting from the library. She recognized Alexander's low tone and another voice, his younger sister, Lady Margaret, who had recently returned from visiting relatives. Alara paused near the door, not intending to eavesdrop, but her name caught her ear. "You can't blame her, Alexander," Margaret said gently. "She did not create this situation." "She is her father's daughter," Alexander replied, his voice edged with cold certainty. She knew exactly what bargain was being struck. "Do not ask me to pretend this is more than it is. I will not dishonor her, but I will not give her false hope either." Alara pressed her palm flat against the wall. Her father's daughter, as if that were a stain. Her father had indeed bargained ruthlessly, but he had also never asked her what she wanted. She had walked into this marriage carrying her own silent grief, dreaming of a true partnership. Now she understood that her husband had already judged her, convicted her, and locked the door on any future that contained tenderness. She did not let them see her. She turned, climbed back up the stairs, and sat before the window in her room until the light faded. The first unexpected emotional shift came on a rainy Tuesday 6 weeks later. Alara was walking back from the village, where she had begun spending more and more time. The tenants' cottages had leaking roofs, and the children lacked proper shoes. She could not change her marriage, but she could change small things. She had quietly begun using the modest personal allowance the Duke had settled on her to buy supplies. She did not speak of it. No one asked. That afternoon she was caught in a sudden downpour. Soaked and shivering, she entered through the kitchen door, hopping to slip upstairs unnoticed. But as she turned the corner, she collided directly with Alexander. His hands reached out to steady her, firm and warm against her shoulders. For one breathless moment his eyes swept over her wet hair, the damp dress clinging to her frame, the parcel of wool socks and medicinal herbs she still clutched to her chest. Something flickered across his face. Concern? Curiosity. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice rough around the edges. "The village," she said simply, pulling back from his grip. "I did not realize the time." His brow furrowed. "You go there often?" It was not a question. She met his gaze and felt a faint, unfamiliar spark of defiance. "I have nothing else to occupy me here, Your Grace." She did not wait for his response. She walked past him, leaving wet footprints on the stone floor, and did not look back. She could not see the way he stood there, watching her ascend the stairs, his jaw tight with something he could not name. The first dinner party at Ashbourne Hall became a quiet battlefield. Lady Cecily, a distant cousin of the Duke, had made herself a frequent guest since Alara's arrival. She was beautiful in the way a winter rose is beautiful, lovely from afar, sharp when touched. Her laughter sparkled whenever Alexander was near, and her eyes constantly measured Alara with something that hovered between pity and scorn. That evening, Cecily raised her wine glass and smiled at the table. "Tell me, Your Grace, do you find the countryside terribly dull after your life in trade circles? I imagine the conversation here must seem quite limited." A few guests tittered nervously. Alara kept her spine straight. "I find the quiet rather peaceful, Lady Cecily. I never valued noise for its own sake." "But surely you miss the excitement," Cecily pressed, tilting her head. "The bustle of merchants' gatherings, the negotiation over silks and spices, it must be in your blood." The word merchants landed like a small, deliberate slap. Alara understood the game. She felt the weight of the table's attention, and for a heartbeat her gaze drifted to Alexander. He was watching, his expression unreadable. She waited for him to deflect the insult, to offer even a thin shield of protection. He said nothing. The silence stretched. Margaret opened her mouth to intervene, but Alara spoke first, her voice calm and even. "One learns to adapt to any environment, Lady Cecily. I find character matters more than occupation." Cecily's eyes narrowed briefly before her smile returned. The conversation shifted, but Alara felt something inside her shift as well. She had stood alone at that table, just as she had stood alone on her wedding night. The Duke's silence was louder than any cruelty. It was permission, permission for the world to treat her as less. That night she lay awake, staring at the canopy above her bed, and made a quiet decision. She would stop hopping. She would stop waiting for a love that would never come. She would build a life not around him but beside him, invisible and self-sufficient. If he would not give her warmth, she would find purpose elsewhere. Spring arrived slowly at Ashbourne Hall, and with it, Alara's quiet transformation became visible. She no longer lingered in corridors hopping to encounter Alexander. She no longer dressed with care in colors she thought he might admire. Instead, she rose early, put on simple gowns, and spent her days among the tenants. She organized repairs for the cottages, taught the younger children to read beneath an old oak tree, and sat with elderly women who had no one else to listen to their stories. The villagers began to smile when they saw her. They called her the gentle Duchess in soft, grateful tones. At home, she was polite to Alexander, elegantly, perfectly polite. She answered his questions, managed the household accounts with flawless efficiency, and never once complained. She also never stayed in a room with him longer than necessary. If he entered the library, she would find a reason to leave. If he joined her for supper, the meal was eaten in near silence, punctuated only by the clink of silverware. She had built an invisible wall, brick by brick, and she no longer let herself feel the cold radiating from his side of the table. Alexander noticed. He could not pinpoint when it began, but something had changed. She no longer looked at him with those searching, hopeful eyes. She no longer lingered by the fireplace as if waiting for him to speak. She had become distant, serene, unreachable. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. One afternoon, he stood by the window of his study and watched her cross the lawn, a basket over her arm, heading toward the village. Her hair was loosely pinned, a few strands escaping in the breeze. She laughed at something a gardener's boy said, and the sound drifted through the open window, light and free. He realized with a start that he had never heard her laugh like that. He had never given her a reason to. A strange, uncomfortable ache settled beneath his ribs. He turned away and poured himself a drink, but the ache remained. The emotional ground cracked further the day Lord Nicholas Sterling arrived. Nicholas Sterling was an old friend of Alexander's, a gentleman with an easy smile and a reputation for effortless charm. He had traveled from London to spend a few weeks in the country, and from the moment he was introduced to Alara, he treated her with open, genuine warmth. There was nothing improper in his manner, but he listened when she spoke. He asked about her work in the village. He laughed at her quiet wit and did not look through her as though she were furniture. Alexander watched it all from across the drawing room, a glass of brandy growing warm in his hand. He saw Nicholas lean closer to her to examine a sketch she had made of the gardens. He saw her smile, shy but real. He felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. The first jealousy arrived not as a lightning strike, but as a slow poison. He found himself cataloging every interaction. He noticed how she lit up when Nicholas entered a room. He noticed that she never lit up for him. The knowledge scraped against his pride and dug deeper into something rawer. One evening, after a small dinner, Nicholas offered his arm to escort Alara to the music room. Alexander watched them go, his chest tight with an emotion he refused to name. Margaret appeared beside him, her expression thoughtful. "You are glaring at your oldest friend as if he were a thief," she murmured. "I am doing no such thing." "Alexander," her voice was gentle but firm, "you have ignored your wife for nearly a year. You cannot resent her for enjoying kind company now." He said nothing, but that night he did not sleep. He sat in his study, the fire burning low, and thought about the woman who no longer waited for him. The breaking point came on an evening softened by early summer twilight. Alara had been helping in the village longer than usual, and Nicholas had escorted her back to the hall. They walked slowly up the drive, heads bent together in quiet conversation. Alexander stood on the terrace, half hidden by a stone pillar, and saw Nicholas touch her hand lightly before bidding her good night. It was a gesture of friendship, nothing more, but something inside Alexander snapped. When Alara entered the house, he was waiting in the corridor. His face was pale, his eyes dark with a storm she had never seen before. "Do you have no sense of propriety?" His voice was low, controlled, but trembling beneath the surface. She stopped in her tracks. "What do you mean?" Walking alone with Sterling, returning after dark, laughing with him as if, he stopped, his fists clenched. "Have you forgotten you are my wife?" The accusation hung between them like a blade. For the first time in months, Alara felt her own anger stir, hot and sharp. "I have forgotten nothing, but I will not apologize for speaking with someone who actually sees me as a person." "I have given you everything," he said, stepping closer. "My name, my home." "You have given me silence," she interrupted, her voice breaking despite her effort to stay calm. "You have given me loneliness in a house full of people. You have looked past me every single day, and now you are angry because someone else chose to look at me kindly. That is not my failing, Your Grace. That is yours." She did not shout. She did not cry. She simply turned and walked away, her footsteps steady on the marble floor. Alexander stood frozen, the truth of her words striking him with the force of a physical blow. He had no defense. She was right. He had starved her of affection and then raged at her for noticing when another offered bread. The following week, Alara requested to move into the dower house on the edge of the estate. It was a small, charming cottage she had helped restore for a widowed tenant who had since moved away. She told Margaret it would give her more privacy. She told the housekeeper it was more convenient for her charity work. But everyone understood the unspoken truth. The Duchess was leaving her husband without ever filing a single paper. Alexander did not refuse her. He could not find the words. But when he watched the servants carry her belongings to the cottage, a cold fear gripped his heart. She had stopped fighting. She had stopped hopping, and silence had finally become distance. The first of the two emotional reveals happened on a rain-lashed afternoon, 2 days after Alara had gone. Alexander had locked himself in his study, unable to focus on any ledger. Guilt churned inside him, a bitter poison he could no longer swallow. On a restless impulse, he walked to the rooms that had been hers. They were neat, empty, holding only the faint scent of lavender. He opened drawers, not sure what he was searching for. In the back of a wardrobe, hidden beneath a folded shawl, he found a small wooden box. Inside were receipts, bills of sale, carefully dated, each one signed by Alara. They detailed the sale of her personal jewelry, pearl earrings, a sapphire brooch, a garnet necklace that had belonged to her late mother. The total sum was substantial, and every coin had been directed toward Ashbourne's tenants. She had paid for a new roof for the blacksmith's cottage. She had bought grain when the winter stores failed. She had hired a physician for a child with fever. She had given away pieces of her past quietly, without telling a soul. His hands trembled as he set the papers down. Beneath them lay a leather-bound journal. He hesitated, knowing he should not open it, but desperation overrode honor. He turned the pages, and what he read shattered him completely. The earliest entries were filled with tentative hope. She had described his eyes, the way his voice made her heart race, her foolish dream that he might one day hold her hand without cold duty. Then the entries shifted. She wrote of overheard words, of cruel silence, of standing in crowded rooms feeling utterly alone. She wrote of the night she stopped expecting him. She wrote of the moment she realized she was unloved and always would be. The last entry, penned just before she moved to the cottage, was only one sentence. I finally understand that some hearts never open, and I can no longer live outside a locked door. Alexander closed the journal and pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the wardrobe. A sound escaped him, something between a sigh and a groan. He had believed he was the wronged party, trapped in a union he had not chosen. He had been blind. She had come to him with a heart full of tenderness, and he had crushed it beneath his pride. He had not been a husband. He had been a prison. The second reveal came from his own house, in the most unexpected way. Lady Cecily, sensing opportunity in the Duchess's departure, had grown bolder. She arrived one afternoon uninvited, floating through the halls as though she already belonged. Alexander, still raw and hollow, asked her bluntly what she wanted. Cecily smiled, mistaking his bluntness for invitation, and let slip a piece of information that froze the air. "You know, I always found it amusing," she said, trailing her fingers along the edge of a table. "The way Alara tried so hard to please you, but then she always did have a weakness for lost causes. Do you remember the charity ball 3 years ago, the one at Danbury House? She was there, you know. She saw you defend that servant boy from Lord Pemberton's whip. Apparently, she never forgot it. She told a mutual acquaintance that you were the most honorable man she had ever seen. I suppose that's why she agreed to this marriage in the first place. Pity you never bothered to learn that." She laughed, a light, careless sound, and drifted out of the room, leaving Alexander rooted to the spot. The charity ball. He remembered it vaguely, a moment of instinct stepping between a frightened boy and a drunken nobleman's rage. He had not thought of it since, but Alara had. She had carried that image of him into their marriage, believing him to be a man of compassion, and he had never given her the chance to see that man again. He had worn his coldness like armor, and all the while she had been loving a ghost of his better self. The realization broke something open inside him. He had not just neglected her. He had betrayed the very hope she had entrusted to him. That evening, Alexander walked to the Dower House. Rain fell softly, misting the meadow and blurring the lights in the cottage windows. He knocked, his heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear the sound. Alara opened the door. She wore a simple gray dress, her hair loose over one shoulder. She looked tired but calm, and when she saw him, her expression did not change. There was no anger, no longing, just quiet, patient waiting. "May I come in?" His voice was hoarse, unfamiliar to his own ears. She hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered the small sitting room where a fire crackled softly. The space smelled of herbs and old books. It was warm, lived in, a home she had built without him. He stood before her, a duke who had once commanded armies of servants and acres of land and felt utterly powerless. "I found the receipts, the jewels, and your journal." He forced the words out. "I know I should not have read it, but I could not stop. Elara, I did not know anything." She said nothing, only watched him with those steady, guarded eyes. "I know now," he continued, his voice cracking. "I know you sold your mother's necklace for people who had nothing. I know you came to this marriage hopping for something I refused to give. I know I have been a fool, a proud and bitter fool, and I have hurt you in ways I cannot undo." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I loved you too late, I know that, but I love you now, and the thought of losing you forever is more than I can bear." He had expected her to weep, to soften, perhaps to fall into his arms. She did none of those things. Instead, she folded her hands in front of her, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle but clear. "I believe that you regret it, Alexander. I believe you feel guilty, but love is not built on guilt. I spent a year trying to reach you, and every time I reached out, you pushed me away. I cannot simply forget that because you have discovered my journal. Trust, once broken, does not heal overnight." Her words, so honest and unflinching, cut him deeper than any rage could have. He nodded slowly, his eyes stinging. "Then let me earn it," he said quietly. "Let me show you that I can be the man you once believed I was. I do not expect forgiveness tonight or even soon, but give me a chance to prove that my regret is not empty. Please." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Not a surrender, but a possibility, a door left slightly ajar. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Ashbourne Hall had ever seen. Alexander did not make grand theatrical gestures. He did not shower her with gifts or empty compliments. Instead, he showed up. Every morning he left a small posy of wildflowers at the gate of the Dower house, the same simple blooms she had once mentioned in an offhand comment months ago. He began visiting the village himself, not to impress her, but to understand what she had been doing. He learned the names of the tenants, sat in their cottages, and listened to their stories. He saw the school she had started beneath the oak tree, and one day, he quietly arranged for a proper schoolhouse to be built, funded entirely from his own coffers in her name. He did not push for her return. He did not demand her time, but whenever they were together he was present. He asked about her day and actually waited for the answer. He looked at her as though she were the most important person in the room, not an afterthought. Slowly, the villagers began to remark on the change. "The Duke has grown a heart," they said, not unkindly. Elara watched it all with a cautious, fragile hope. She wanted to believe him. The part of her that had once dreamed of love still flickered, weak but stubborn. Yet fear held her back. She was terrified that if she opened her heart again, the coldness would return, and this time it would destroy her completely. The final emotional turn happened on an afternoon of golden light and unexpected vulnerability. Elara had walked to the garden behind the hall, drawn by the scent of late roses. Alexander found her there, standing near the fountain, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. He approached slowly, as if afraid she might vanish. "I have a confession," he said, his voice low and unsteady. "I was not only blind, I was afraid." She turned to face him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "When my father died," he continued, "he left ruin behind. I had to become strong, unyielding. I thought feeling anything deeply was a weakness. When you arrived, so full of quiet grace, I did not know how to hold it. I was terrified that if I let myself care for you, I would lose you too, or worse, you would see the broken man behind the title and be disappointed." He drew a shaking breath. "So I pushed you away before you could reject me. It was the greatest mistake of my life." She saw it then, the frightened boy behind the cold Duke, the man who had locked himself away because he did not know how to be loved without armor. Her heart ached, not just for herself, but for him. She stepped closer, her voice softer than a whisper. "I was never going to reject you, Alexander. I only wanted you to let me in." Something broke in him, a dam finally giving way. He reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. His fingers were warm and trembling. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss there, lingering and reverent. "I cannot undo the past," he said, his eyes wet. "But I swear to you, for every day that remains, I will be the husband you deserved from the beginning, if you will have me." She did not answer with words. Instead, she lifted her free hand and touched his cheek, the first tender gesture she had offered him since their wedding day. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if it were salvation. They did not rush. Healing was not a swift current but a slow, steady tide. She moved back to the hall the following week, but into her own chambers with a door that connected to his study. They took meals together, not out of duty but by choice. He read to her in the evenings, his voice low and soothing. She taught him to listen to the tenants' concerns without trying to fix everything immediately. They walked the gardens in the twilight, hands brushing, then holding, then clinging. One night, as autumn turned the leaves to flame, he found her in the library, curled in a chair with a book. He knelt beside her, his eyes earnest. "I once told you this was a marriage of convenience. I was wrong. It is a marriage of my heart, and I am grateful every day that you gave me a second chance." She set the book aside and smiled, a real, full smile that reached her eyes. "I did not give it lightly, but you earned it, Alexander Blackwood. You truly did." He rested his forehead against hers, and for the first time in years he felt whole. The seasons turned, bringing winters made warm by shared fires, springs fragrant with the blooms she had planted in the garden he had built her. Ashbourne Hall, once a cold, echoing monument to pride, became a home filled with laughter and gentle affection. The tenants prospered, the village school grew, and the Duke and Duchess became beloved not for their titles, but for their kindness. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the candles burned low, Alexander would take Alara's hand and lead her to the window that overlooked the rolling hills. They would stand in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one, two people who had found each other through pain and distance, and who had chosen, against all odds, to heal together. She was no longer a bargain. She was his heart, and he made sure she knew it, not just in words but in every quiet, faithful moment of the life they built, side by side, never invisible again.